Good morning, everybody. How are you? Everybody have a nice, enjoyable evening? Nice late evening, a little slow this morning? Yeah, that's okay. We saw some of the students that were up a little bit late from some of the universities. They're moving a little slow this morning. It'll be all right. So anyways, I'm John Tomecek from Texas A&M Agrilife Extension Service. My counterpart with USDA-Wildlife Wildlife Services, Mike Bodenchuck, is standing in the back. We'll be presenting this morning kind of a concept on the role of predator management in regards to your wildlife management. So we talk about predator management for livestock protection. That's one set of concepts. In the world of wildlife management, it's another set of concepts. So we wanted to bring the wildlife manager's perspective this morning to you, thinking about what we know from a scientific perspective, how that applies on the landscape to reach different wildlife management goals. So we'll be tag teaming the talk this morning, Mike and I, and then we'll have time for questions at the end. So we wanted to start with a few basic sets of basic concepts to introduce what we're thinking about with predation. Some general rules of thumb that we have thinking as wildlife managers. Predation is a naturally occurring event. We know that, and that happens out on the landscape. It's one of those things that shapes both the predator and the prey community. Both of them are adapted to deal one with the other, and that active predation helps form those communities we have of animals out on the landscape. One of those events where we often ask people, why is the pronghorn so fast? Why do you put that kind of energy into that kind of speed? Well, there are a lot of reasons for that, but escaping a predator can be one of them. The other idea is that predation is something that cannot, by nature, and should not be eliminated because it has a value out on the landscape. But at the same time, when we think as wildlife managers, we're not pure preservationists that leave the world alone. We take advantage of that natural resource. We use that resource. We conserve it. So there are times when predation can impact prey in a way that is counter to human goals and our goal as wildlife managers. So that's where predator management comes in, of course. And my clicker's not clicking. So I always like to start with a cartoon, and I hope you can see the cartoon in the back if you haven't seen it before. When I talk about wildlife management, it's about maintaining balance in all things and in all ways, so that you and I can take advantage of that natural resource. So I always enjoy this cartoon. It's wolves and wolf cubs, and the caption up here, if you can't read it, says, well, that was the last elk. Now what are we going to eat? So is it a top-down approach or a bottom-up approach? What actually manages the resource? Is it predators out there on the landscape, or is it the lack of prey? So something we're going to talk about today is understanding the way that predators and prey actually react and interact with one another. So the concept is it bottom-up? Is it the abundance of prey that regulates our number of predators, how their populations rise and fall, and how they grow? Or is it a top-down approach where the number of predators actually regulate the prey, and so we need to remove predators from the landscape in order to let those prey species recover? Truth is, the habitat ends up dictating everything. Plants dictate all. We have a prey base for predators to use. Sometimes there's a predator impact on the prey base. Sometimes there's a prey impact on the predators. It's neither one or the other. So what we're going to talk about instead is a set of functional relationships. So research over the years has given us a number of different general relationships with how predators and prey interact. For every issue we deal with in conservation, you'll look at one of these relationships and you'll say, yeah, I don't think that has anything to do with the species I'm managing for. I don't think that's one of our relationships. Chances are one of them will resonate with you pretty well, depending on what you're looking at and what you're working with. And this is where we start to understand the role of predator management with our wildlife. So what we always talk about, sorry, I forgot my bullet point was down here. So on the bottom, we always think about, okay, I'm going to do my management. I'm going to get out in the pasture. I'm going to make a difference. Wonderful. We have to know where we are, what we're working with before we apply management activities. So we need to understand where our game species, if we're managing for game, where they are today, what the relationships look like so that we can move forward in a meaningful way without doing more harm than good. So the first one we're going to talk about of these functional relationships is what we call a low-density equilibrium. So I've got a more complicated graph I'm going to show you after a few basic points, but low-density equilibriums, essentially, you've got some native predation that is actually maintaining a fairly low density of these animals, these prey animals. Imagine it being one of your game species that you're working with. So this is well below K, and K being the capacity of the vegetation on the landscape to maintain a certain number of animals. So that carrying capacity based on the plants. So it's actually below K. We've got more habitat, more food out in the pasture than we have animals to consume, and predators are actually keeping numbers down. One of these classic examples that we like to talk about is from the Kaibab Plateau out off the Grand Canyon. From the early part of the 20th century, intense predator control was done. If you took a wildlife management class in college, this is a classic Aldo Leopold story. So predator control was done to remove all predation possible to help restore game out on the Kaibab. They did an incredible job of that. They did such a good job, in fact, that in the early 1900s we had almost no deer, and then look at my curve. Look at that massive growth, and you see how it peaks. So we released these prey species from predators keeping numbers down. Wonderful. But then what happened? They peak out and then they crash. Why would they crash at a point? Well, I don't know about you, but if HEB runs out of groceries, I'm kind of out of luck for the most part. I can feed myself for a little while, but I will run out of food eventually. So then we come back down, and we creep down, creep down, creep down, and at some point we get back down to a level of what we can actually sustain. So let's look at what that graph really looks like. So let's see if my pointer will work this morning. So can you see my pointer on the screen okay? All right, so we've got density over here on the left, and we've got number of years traveling upward to the right. So we're looking at our dotted line on the top. This is our vegetative carrying capacity. So for our prey animal, for the game species we're wondering about, let's just say it's white-tailed deer right now, this is what the plants in the pasture can actually support in terms of number of animals before we take a very steep dive on habitat quality and have to remove animals from a habitat manager's perspective. So we've got some low density of deer down here that's regulated by predation. It's a density-dependent predation effect, so the more deer we have, the more predators we have. Very good. We're maintained at some level. Here we have a predator control action. So we have some rapid increase in the number of animals after a control. Very good. So we've removed predators, numbers have grown, but up here we don't quite get to carrying capacity K, unlike the graph I showed you on the last screen. Food competition's really not that important because we never met the level of vegetation that we had out in the pasture. So we've had a nice increase in the number of deer. Wonderful. We've controlled predators. We made more deer. That seems like a nice relationship for a manager to have. And at some point after this control activity, you're going to have populations return to pre-controlled numbers, pre-controlled density, when the predator numbers recover. This makes sense to us on many different levels when you're dealing with issues. I'll put it to you this way. Do you control mesquite? Do you control it just one time and that pasture's free of mesquite forever? Oh, of course not. It's an ongoing activity. So we have a control, we release these prey animals, we ascend to a number, but we haven't hit a number that destroys habitat, and we balance back out again. So this low-density equilibrium, we can release you from it, but you'll end up back there eventually because this is where the predators and the prey end up on your place interacting with one another. So the next one we're going to talk about is multiple stable states. So this concept's a little bit different, but it's got some similar parts and pieces. So in the last one, our density and our abundance really depended in many ways upon the number of predators out in the pasture actually regulating the number of prey. This one changes that up a little bit, and there are 2 or 3 different things interacting. So we've got abundance based on, in some parts, predation, it's true, but now we've got a limitation on vegetation, a limitation on food plants affecting our prey population, our game animals. So after a predator removal, we get target species, our game, meeting or exceeding K, what the plants on the landscape can actually support. So kind of like our Kaibab example from earlier. So we have a response in the plant community, meaning that quality of habitat can decline because of overabundance of deer, which I'm sure no one has ever seen too many deer. Not once, right? Never seen a browse line in your life. You ever seen a double browse line? Ever been around giraffes? Yeah, you get a browse line down here and a browse line up here. It's fascinating. So let's look at what that relationship looks like. So we get to these multiple equilibria. We have still that carrying capacity at the top. You start somewhere down below. Let me get my pointer back up. You start somewhere down here. We get this first equilibrium regulated by density-dependent predation, meaning that we increase to some level and the predators and the prey interact with one another, and we're maintained at some level of what the prey can do in terms of reproduction and avoiding predation, and what the predators can impact in terms of reducing prey on the landscape. We then have an activity where we remove predators. We go out there and make a predator control action and say, we're going to get out and remove coyotes or bobcats. And we do that. We release these deer, if you want to say, from more predation, and so they increase in their numbers. Wonderful. So we end up getting towards K, where now we've exceeded or met the food plants out in the pasture that we can actually support our animals with. So we did make more deer. But the problem we ran into is even though we made more deer, there wasn't enough food to feed them all. And now we have a management issue on ourselves where we need to, as managers, we're concerned about our habitat. Now we've got to bring deer numbers down. So we put some effort out in the pasture on predator control, and then we had to put some effort out on deer control because now our habitat is suffering. So 2 or 3 things interacting here, not just the abundance of predators, but also the availability of vegetation. So next one we're going to talk about is a stable limit cycle. So if you ever had one of these classes in college that talked about populations of predators and prey, we have the classic example of snowshoe rabbits and Canada lynx, where predators and prey rose and fell together, but there's a little bit of a lag time, right? We make lots of new prey animals, and that means the predators can raise more young and become more numerous, and at some point we put a herd on the prey numbers and run them down, and then predators starve, and we go up and down. So we have another factor actually interacting here. If you remember the old snowshoe hare and Canada lynx example, we had this from fur trapper data for many years, for centuries. And we thought it's predators and prey, and that's the only thing going on there. Turns out there was another element there that we didn't know about, which was weather cycles were impacting the abundance of a particular food item for the rabbits. We didn't know that their numbers were actually being driven by the availability of food. So as weather, which in Texas, do we have variable weather, or does it rain whole lots all the time and everything looks great? Exactly. Well, sometimes it rains great. Remember Harvey, when the water was up here and the only thing showing above water was the top of the tank dam, maybe? So when a weather impact affects these predators, we have a goal that we're trying to get to with our prey animals. We have something impacting other than just the vegetation growing on its own, other than just predation out in the pasture. So we have these natural cycles that we end up seeing with our predators and our prey. It's not that it's some strange event that happens only once. It's something that's fairly regular. We experience drought in Texas. It's a pretty regular cycle. We don't like it, but we're used to it. You feel it coming. You know what happens. We as land managers know what we're going to need to do in a broad sense, and the predators and the prey are going to rise and fall. So we have to ask ourselves here, what can we actually change with regards to weather, and what's our real goal with management in these times? So what these end up looking like for a stable limit cycle, we have some number, we have an increase. So in this example, it can be in an area that's got mild winters versus extremely harsh winters. In Texas, I like to think about decent rainfall years and then awful rainfall years where we make no plants in the pasture. So we have some increase due to a more mild weather condition, a more favorable condition for our prey animals, for our game, and they increase. And you have some amount of density-independent predation where numbers are increasing, and there's some predation out there. But we get to a point, and predators also are increasing about the time that prey reach this vegetation carrying capacity. So we've met the level of food out in the pasture because we've had great years and things have risen, and then the weather changes, and the availability of food either declines or we have more animals than we can support. At the same time, predators have increased in numbers, and so the natural cycle begins to take over. Numbers of prey animals decrease, predator impacts increase because the weather has changed, and we now have density-dependent predation where we're taking more and more prey animals for what can be supported. So prey numbers come back down as the weather is also poor. Our plants can recover, and after they recover and prey numbers come back up, then the predators come back up, and we have these cycles that repeat over time. We see this in a lot of predator-prey interactions. We see this in quite a few of our prey animals, our game animals, left to their own devices. Now, this is not talking about in the face of harvest operations, in the face of weather, when we still need to maintain these operations on our ranches. This is just what these predators and prey do on their own. So the last one we're going to talk about before I turn it over to Mike to take these relationships and move forward into what it looks like from a effect of prey or predation on prey. We have what we call recurrent fluctuations. So we have some long-term trend, and it's pretty stable. It's been pretty flat. We've had it for many, many years. We know what it looks like. And then some very odd event happens, some unusual thing occurs, and we have an eruption of our prey animals, of our game animals. Who knows what it is, but they have one event that occurs and numbers skyrocket. We have large numbers of animals. All of a sudden, the predator community will respond at some point. That vegetative carrying capacity is probably reached because we had some crazy eruption of prey. They've met their habitat level, what it can support, and then at some point they'll have to come back down. So what happens here? As we talk about, we've got a long-term density. It says infrequent population increase, meaning it's not a regular cycle that we can predict. It's something unusual that occurs and drives prey numbers way up. They probably reach carrying capacity. They decline because there's food competition, not enough food to go around for all these animals, and predation starts to be a factor. And after we decline from that, we've reached carrying capacity, we've hit the ceiling. Animals have to come back down somehow, if that's predation, starvation, competition, and they do come back down. We get back to some kind of new long-term mean, some new long-term average of how we're going to have these game animals looking. But the problem is, these are not always predictable. We may hope that it comes back down to the level that it was. To us, the habitat may look the same, but at the same time, it may be different enough that we may move now a rung down on the ladder to a long-term mean that is less animals, fewer animals, lower density than what it was before. And I'm sure none of us can think of any animals that do this out in nature when we have cycles that go like this, and yet over time our numbers have steadily declined on a mean. We've got several animals that do that. There's a bobwhite in a cage over there if you want to go look at it. So we've seen these things. We don't know why they happen. We get these eruptions, and then numbers come back down, up and down and up and down. We don't always know where that new mean will be. It's possible that it's better than where we were before. That does happen, but it's unpredictable is the point. So for us as wildlife managers, our goal being something long-term that's sustainable that we can predict a harvest on, that's not good for you and I. You and I want something where if we have a cycle, we know how to work with it, or a long-term mean that we can more or less manage. So these are the functional relationships that over the years in science we've tended to see with various prey and predator interactions. Most things tend to fit one of these cycles. Now we're going to move into a discussion of primary and secondary predator effects on those prey populations. So I'm going to turn the floor over at this point to my friend Mike Bodenchuck to talk through these things with y'all.
Thank you, John. The clicker doesn't work, right? It's a government clicker. It doesn't work and you can't fire it. Okay. So we understand that predators can impact prey. What we have done for decades as wildlife biologists is put radio collars on stuff and see how many get eaten. That's the primary effects of predation. How many deer fawn got eaten by coyotes? And if deer died that weren't eaten by coyotes, we say, well, it's habitat related. Okay? What we're starting to learn is there's two different kinds of predator effects, and I'm going to go through those. The first is primary predation. How many get eaten? The second is behavioral changes. First thing I want to recognize, there's positive effects to predation. Thank God something eats feral pigs. You know, the predation is good. That's the reason mule deer stop. That's the reason pronghorn have eyes high on their head. All of these are adaptations to predation. So when I talk about some of these impacts, I'm going to talk about the negative impacts. I know there's positive impacts, and I don't want to mislead anybody there. There it is. Okay. So we talk about how many are killed by predators. That's the primary impact, and that's been our research focus for decades. The secondary things are changes in behavior associated with the risk of predation. That's a different kind of thing, and I'll give you some examples. In primary predation, in the Strawberry Valley in central Utah, they've got a sage-grouse population. They removed grazing. They've got invasive red fox. We put radios on 27 sage-grouse hens to see what habitat they picked for nesting. They didn't live long enough to pick habitat for nesting. 25 of the 27 were killed by mammalian predators in that ecosystem. That's a primary effect of predation. Predation by coyotes and cougars on fawns. When I was in college, I worked on a deer study area in the northern deer study in New Mexico. We had a low-density area. There's a little point that sticks out into the Canadian River Canyon outside of Roy. I had 13 does that had radio collars on. I caught fawns from every one of my does. The first fawn we caught, if you understand Spanish, it was named Primero, and it was the last one to be killed by predators. He was 42 days old when the predators got him. So all my fawns were killed, and none of them made it more than a month and a half. Lions, one or two lion kills, and the rest were coyotes. Primary predation. Black-footed ferrets. We raise black-footed ferrets for release. They're completely dependent on prairie dogs. It costs about $7,000 to get one of these little things out there, and when you turn them loose and don't do any predation management at all, coyotes eat them like popcorn. You get about a 30% 30-day survival rate if you don't do some kind of predation management. Mostly coyotes. Owls also eat them. And then translocated bighorn sheep. We've had to change the way we relocate bighorn sheep simply because if you put out 13 bighorn sheep and there's any lions in the area, they can eat them down before they ever get up to breeding age. So now you're seeing large bighorn sheep transplants, 30, 40, 50 sheep in a sheep dump because they have to deal with lion problems. So let's talk about secondary effects. We learned a lot about predation from the Yellowstone Park wolf reintroduction. When they put wolves in there, the northern elk herd was 17,000 elk. There was what they called the firing line at Garner. When those elk migrated out of the park, they had cow hunts, and everybody had an elk tag, and everybody could kill a cow, and it was just that was how they were managing that herd. You didn't even need a rifle. You needed a pair of tennis shoes to beat somebody else to the elk. There are now 3,000 elk in that northern herd. The wolves didn't eat all of them. The wolves chased their prey. So Yellowstone elk used to hang around in the meadows. They'd lay around in the meadows and they'd eat grass all day long. And with wolves in the ecosystem, be 100 elk in the meadow, the wolves come in, they pull one down, and 99 of them go, I'm not going back to that meadow. And now the elk are standing around underneath the timber on the steep slopes to escape predation. Their calf ratios are lower. Their individual survival is lower. We got elk starving to death in what we used to consider a mild winter because they don't have access to the resources. They've changed their individual behavior and their group behavior to avoid the risk of predation. Bighorn sheep in the Sierra Nevadas. When lions are around bighorn sheep, they stay in the rocks. And their lamb survival is less, and their lamb reproduction is less because they can't get out and get the grass. Without any lions around them, they get out into the meadows and they get quite a ways away from the rocks. And this has been documented. It's the behavioral shift of the prey. Nesting waterfowl on Bear River Refuge. There was a big refuge at the north end of the Great Salt Lake. 85% of the cinnamon teal on the continent are born in that area. Before a flood, they used to produce 80,000 ducklings on this refuge. It's one of the first. It's actually called a bird refuge because it's so old. That was the name that was given to it. After the flood, they went in there and created dikes to prevent future flooding. And now all the nesting habitat is linear. So one raccoon walking that dike can get every duck nest, whereas before it was all scattered out. So these are secondary effects. The ducks quit nesting there. We put up a predator exclosure. We had one nest to every 2 acres inside the exclosure. We had no nests outside the exclosure. Zero. They know better than to do that. Every time they try to lay an egg, a predator bumps them, they leave. They go find another place. So that habitat selection was based on that. And there's some fascinating examples in aquatic systems. Biologists like to study aquatic systems because the prey can't leave, you know. So they've got little fish. They're filter feeders. They eat algae. And without any predators in this ecosystem, in this aquatic ecosystem, they're keeping the algae eaten. They're foraging out in the open water, and they're eating the algae, and they're keeping the water clean, and there's no algae bloom. They put a few predator fish in there, and the filter feeders pull back to the edges where there's a bunch of weeds, and you get an algae bloom that's the result of predator presence. That's fascinating to me. That's the very basis of life systems. That's the bottom of the food chain, is that algae bloom. And the algae bloom can be affected by the presence of predators. There's another system where they had snails going up and down aquatic vegetation. And these snails, when they feed, they'll feed on the tips of the aquatic vegetation and keep it groomed back. They keep it hedged. And the aquatic vegetation stays low in the water. They didn't introduce snail predators. They introduced the smell of snail predators. They put snail predators in another tank and ran the water through the first tank, and all the snails retreated to the base of the plant. They no longer grazed out there on the tips, and those plants choked out the system. I may not be giving a snail enough credit. I don't think the snail says, I smell a predator, I'm going to retreat. That's an instinctive, that's a bred-in, evolved behavior that's based on the risk of predation, and it's not a generational thing. This snail can feed out there, but it pulls back. So it's really a fascinating example from these aquatic systems. So, as biologists, we have said for years, is it habitat related? Is it predator related? Is it habitat? We put deer studies. The very first wildlife monograph was on deer in the Piceance Basin, and there were some pretty smart people that put radio collars on deer, and they followed those deer, and if coyotes killed them, they said it was predators. If lions killed them, it was predators. If they starved to death, it was habitat. Well, once you understand these secondary effects, I don't think we can make that decision anymore. It might be the predators are keeping them from getting to the habitat. Remember, too, that habitat's food, cover, water, and for a coyote, habitat includes deer as food. So there's that. But we cannot anymore say that it's just one or the other. You got to figure out that it goes in. The access to resources being limiting is a critical piece of this thing. And we see there's a deer herd in northern Utah. They've got 70 fawns per 100 does surviving to the first of winter. But they go down to the winter range and they can't get all the way to the bottom. The deer stay high on the mountain, and many of the fawns die. But every time one goes to the bottom, the coyotes run it down and they kill it, and the rest of them go back up. And so there's access to habitat that may be important. I have been poor as long as anybody in this room, and I understand when it comes to wildlife, we've got to decide where we're going to put our money. Do we put it in habitat protection, habitat development? Do we put it in predator control? There's always a need for habitat work. Habitat work, in my opinion, is a process, and you never quit. As soon as you turn off that bulldozer, there's a mesquite that sprouts behind you. You're going to have to do habitat work forever. And habitat work is what you do for tomorrow, for 5 years from now, for 10 years from now. That's what habitat work does. You try and keep your carrying capacity or improve your carrying capacity by doing habitat work. Predator work is what you do for today. If you have habitat that's going underutilized, you do predator work for today. We've got pronghorn habitat in West Texas, but we had a die-off. So we bring in more pronghorn to try and get them back. But if there's a big pulse of predators there, they could knock them back. So we consider that. But this is for today. You don't do it for a long time. So apparently I don't know how to do that. The one thing, and I mentioned it in the pronghorn example, if you're in a restoration cycle, there's three times that I want to consider predator management for wildlife protection. Maybe four. The first one is restoration. We're bringing in bighorns. We're bringing in something to try and restore it. These are high-value species. We've got a lot invested in them. We're going to go ahead and protect those that we bring in. The second is if we have an area that's specifically set aside for something. That Bear River Refuge is specifically set aside to produce ducks. Avocets and cinnamon teal are the most important things that come out of that, and the whole continental population is based on one ecosystem. We might do it forever on that ecosystem if we have to keep those other populations set aside. So if you've got something that's specifically set aside for a purpose, let's consider predator management. The third one is if we have a population that's underperforming and we think it may be related to predation. So not just we've got a deer at 50% of our population objective. We've got deer at 50% of our population objective, and we've got 35 or 4 or 20 or 15 fawns per 100 does. That's an indication that predation may be working on those fawns, and we may consider predator management in that circumstance. That make sense? The fourth one, and it does affect, intensive management, but we can talk about genetics. Predators will determine some genetic characteristics like escape cover, but that may not be what you're breeding for. So we can talk about that later. I was asked to develop predator management for mule deer protection for the state of Utah. I did that about 20 years ago, and the Wildlife Agency said, it looks like it's working, but we want you to tell us why. Develop a white paper. And we got into the literature, and we looked at a lot of those different studies, and we came up with a bunch of factors that we group. Habitat factors, things about predator populations, and things about prey. The habitat factors, things like linear habitat, the dikes that I mentioned on Bear River Refuge. One raccoon can walk that dike and get all those nests. So you may do 80% raccoon removal and still have predation impacts because there's still enough left. What's another example of linear habitat? Riparian corridors. If you've got a species that needs a creek and you've got one creek, a predator can hunt that creek. A beach is the most linear habitat that I can think of. All the sea turtles have to lay their eggs on the beach. Within 100 yards of the high tide mark, all of the nests are going to be there. And one sounder of feral pigs walking up and down that beach can find every single nest because it's very, very linear. Access to water. We've done a good job in restoring bighorn sheep, and I like bighorn sheep, and I'm in favor of it, but we put a water source out there, an artificial water source out there, and all of a sudden we created predator habitat. Mountain lions couldn't live in this desert range before we put water there, and we concentrated everything on the water. The lion doesn't have to hunt sheep all over the mountain. He goes and waits at the water for 2 days. The sheep are going to come in. So access to water can affect predation rates. Fires can influence predation rates. When you have a fire, usually it doesn't burn completely clear. A big fire, there'll be little patches of habitat in the middle. Sage grouse are really bad about this. There might be 10 acres, 15 acres of sage in the middle of a big burn, and a coyote can go through that sage grouse habitat real fast and find every grouse that he wants. Also, it pushes your prey, it pushes your predators to the edge of the fire, and so that makes them more vulnerable. Excessive cover. Pronghorns will quit a place when the brush comes in because it's too much cover. They can no longer detect the predators sneaking up on them. We talk about managing prairie dogs by putting predator blinds out there. Put a hay bale in the middle of the prairie dog town, and a coyote can sneak up behind it and actually get on them. Badgers can sneak up behind it. So excessive cover is one of those things. Drought. The single greatest correlation we have between mule deer survival and anything we can measure is rainfall. Drought. In a dry year, you have fewer fawns survive. Why is that? One of my trappers said, well, they thirsty to death. They don't die because they're thirsty. In a drought, they're born about a pound lighter than if they were born in a wet year. So they're vulnerable to predation more. In a drought, there's less cover for them to hide in. So they're vulnerable to predation more. In a drought, their mother has to spend more time getting her groceries, so she spends more time away from them. So they're vulnerable to predation more. Probably the biggest thing that happens in a drought is there's less alternative prey. There's not as many cottontails, there's not as many cotton rats, and those coyotes are going to eat something. And so mule deer that are born in a drought are not genetically inferior to their brothers and sisters that were born in a wet year, but they're much more vulnerable to predation, and we have bad survival in dry years. Perches. We've created artificial perches. We've got ravens that are exploding across the landscape. We've got crows that are expanding their range across the western landscape, and it has to do with transmission lines and places to perch and artificial nest habitat. And so those things that are impacted by raptors can be impacted by artificial perches. And escape cover. If you don't have escape cover, you're done. In some years in the Dakotas, the ice forms and the cattails stay there, and the pheasants can dive into those cattails. And it's not just escape cover from predators, but it's thermal cover. But if they have a really, really wet summer and that water gets deeper, those cattails can't grow in as thick an area, and all of a sudden the escape cover disappears. So a wet summer followed by a severe winter is hell on pheasants in the Dakotas because of escape cover. So predator factors, there's a number of factors. The number of predators is got to be part of it. And that's the only thing, by the way, when we do research we ever try to change. There's all these other factors and we only change one, the number of predators. And the number of predators certainly has something to do with it. The social structures of predators. You know that foxes breed before their first birthday, and so in the springtime all foxes are breeders. Coyotes don't breed till their second year. Essentially, a female coyote has her first litter on her second birthday. So you've got breeding coyotes out there. You've got last year's models, the 2017s that are out there that are not breeders. And then you've got this year's pups out there on the landscape. That social structure affects how many predators there are out there on the landscape. Invasive predators, those red fox in Strawberry Valley were invasive. Those sage-grouse never evolved with that kind of predation pressure. Territoriality. Coyotes are territorial. Lions, very territorial. You can only cram so many of them into a mountain range. Raccoons are not territorial. You're talking about nest predators. You got groceries, you got raccoons. And in fact, on a 4 square mile area, we could not affect raccoon densities because every time we killed one, another one showed up. It was good habitat, and they come pounding in there. If you get a big enough landscape, you can thin them down in the center. But territoriality, or the lack of territoriality, affects those predation rates. The ability to bridge to other prey. Mountain lions can bridge to other prey, and if they've got livestock as a buffer, they have done that in Arizona studies. Coyotes can make a living off mesquite beans if they have to. So they're very, very effective. Canada lynx can't do anything. If snowshoe rabbits crash, they're done. You know, their survival goes way down. Individual behavior. You cannot discount individual behavior. We had a mountain lion area, a sheep area west of my house. There was a tom lion and a female lion on there when we introduced bighorn sheep. We put about 50 bighorn sheep on there. We had the lions were radio collared. The sheep, some of them were radio collared. We had the tom lion. Once he discovered them, he'd kill an adult bighorn about every 6 days. He'd go walk about looking for another female, and he'd come back and kill a sheep and eat on it for a few days and then go out again. After the third one, we removed him. You know, we didn't bring these sheep in to make sure he had groceries. That female lion stayed in that study area, and for the duration of her collar, we never had her kill a bighorn. She raised kittens one year in that area, and we never had her kill a bighorn. I don't know why, but individual behavior does factor into it. And then multiple predator species. And we're short on time. I'm trying to go through this really fast, but I got to tell you about this. Lions eat bucks, mule deer bucks, whitetail bucks, in greater abundance than their percentage in the population. So if bucks are 25% of a population, they may be 40% of the lion's diet. And there's a number of reasons for that. They move around more. They get off as individuals. They don't get in herds as much. They use rougher country. So bucks are more vulnerable to predation, detection, and lions eat them in greater abundance. Lions eat does and fawns in relative abundance to each other. So if you've got 100 fawns per 100 does, half of the non-buck part of a lion's diet is going to be does, and half of it's going to be fawns. And this blew my mind, and I had to model this, but if the coyotes or the drought or whatever is whacking the fawns, then lion predation has to shift to breeding age does. The same number of lions eating the same number of deer can either be additive or compensatory, depends on how many fawns are out there on the ground. When we started doing this in Utah, we looked at that relationship and we said, you know what, we can hurt these lions if we overharvest them. We don't think we can hurt coyotes. We can't kill enough coyotes to actually damage the population. In order to mitigate the lion predation, where they were eating adult does, We just put more fawns on the ground. We did coyote work to put more fawns on the ground, and some of that lion predation spilled over into the fawns. We didn't have the breeding age does being hit as hard. So, on the prey factors, relationship to K. That's carrying capacity right there. In that picture, one cow is carrying capacity. There's nothing else out there. If you're at or above your carrying capacity, if you're feeding deer just to keep them alive, not for genetics or to get them in front of a blind or whatever. If you're feeding them to keep them alive, you don't need to do predator management because you're already at carrying capacity. Breeding synchrony. We had a deer herd there in Utah that they said, it's a piss poor deer herd that can't take some predation. And I agree, but we had 4 bucks per 100 does at breeding time. The deer season was pre-rut. 4 bucks per 100 does. We had a 2.5-month long breeding season. We had a 2.5-month long fawning season. Some of those does were coming in heat and there weren't enough bucks to go around. And that's the definition of a poor deer herd. When you got 4 bucks per 100 does, it's down. The way caribou respond to wolf predation, the way wildebeest respond to everything that wants to eat a wildebeest, is to drop all their fawns in a real narrow, or the calves in a real narrow window, so that the predators cannot eat all of them. You'll have the same level of predation, but if they're all born in the same window, if you've got a 2.5-month long fawning season, the same pair of coyotes can eat all of your fawns. So breeding synchrony is one of those things. Group size and composition. Old elk can detect predators faster and quicker and more vigilant than young elk. So if you've got older elk in the herd, they can detect wolves. They spend more time around the outside edge. It makes a difference in predation. This one's probably the biggest one in my mind. If there's something else out there for them to eat, they can find that. In a good year for cotton rats, coyotes are going to eat cotton rats. They're not going to spend the energy to chase a deer fawn for half a section. They're going to go ahead and eat those cotton rats, those cottontails. And so with enough alternative prey, which gets back to your habitat, if you're in this picture, there are not many cottontails there either, is there? There are not many cotton rats in that picture. There's not much alternative prey. So, what can you do about it? That's probably why you came here. There are some non-lethal strategies. You could do some habitat modification. If you've got linear habitat like a power line going through your property, it's linear. You want to manage that for quail habitat, break it out. Make some pockets going off of that thing so that you don't have to open up a lot, but you break out that linear stuff. You can't change the power line, but you could change the brush line on the edge. Increased buck-doe ratios. Get that breeding synchrony down. You really want a tight rut window. You really do for predation management. You could do non-lethal removal of individual predators. That's what they're doing with gray wolves, the Mexican wolf in New Mexico. Those animals are so valuable for genetic stock that they're not going to kill them. They'll catch them, put them back into breeding, put somebody else out there on the landscape. So that is an option. We'll do that with coyotes. We've got so many coyotes, there's no place to take them. So, selective predator removal can address both primary and secondary effects. And by selective, I'm talking about a number of things. You need to be specific to the predator that you're working on and the area that's important. I can kill all the coyotes I want in the valley. If the fawning habitat's on top of the mountain, it's not going to help. The critical areas in Texas are probably around water sources where everything has to clash. You need to address a specific concern. I want to kill coyotes may be okay if you're the landowner and you want to kill coyotes, but killing coyotes in November is not going to save fawns in June. Killing breeding coyotes in fawning areas in March, February, that's going to make a difference. I want to take those breeding coyotes. 80% of the sheep losses in the summertime, lamb losses, are due to coyotes that are provisioning their pups. The same thing's going on out there in the landscape. Those non-territorial coyotes, the 2017 models I was talking about, are out there running around just trying to stay out of the way. The breeders have got a territory established. They're feeding a litter right now. They're going to be the ones that are doing the most. Age structure of that population, really important. Those 5-year-old pairs have spent 3 years on that territory. They know how to hunt fawns. If you kill them and they get replaced by a 2-year-old pair, you've actually helped your predation problem, if you had a problem. You've reduced the amount of predation on there for at least a year. We see a secondary effect. Even though the coyote numbers are the same, you've dropped that age class of predator. So you need to address a specific thing. Are we talking about adult survival on sage grouse? We took the red fox out. We got adult survival up to 67% the next year. That's about all you can do with a bird, man. I mean, you can't get upland game higher than 67%. But we also had a problem with chick survival and egg survival. We wanted 2 chicks per hen. We had 0.2 chicks per hen. So after we got rid of the red foxes, we started looking at the nest sites, and we found out that ravens were whacking the eggs. So we did fox removal and raven removal. We went to 2.2 chicks per hen and 67% adult survival, and that population tripled in about 4 years. So you got to pick what it is you're working on and to define where it is. Selective predator removal. You got to monitor your targets. You got to monitor your component. If we're going to do it for fawns, then I want to know where I was for fawn survival compared to where I'm going. Our original study design has always been, here we've got a deer herd with no predators. Here we got, or no predator problem. Here we got a herd with problems. So we're going to do predator control over here, and we're going to compare them. In the ideal situation, you brought your problem area up to par. But the best way to monitor this is pre and post control. For the last 4 years, my deer herd's doing this, my fawn rates are this, and we started doing control and they went to this. So do your pre and post control monitoring. You need that data. You need to count those deer. You need to count chicks. You need to standardize how you do that. To do it any other way is not management. And it's okay. You can hunt coyotes and you can hunt bobcats and you can hunt red foxes, but that's not management for your prey base. That's a different kind of thing. I think that's about it. How are we doing for time? We're about out of time. John and I are going to be around this morning all day. We'll be around this evening. If you've got questions, we'd be happy to talk to you about that. Thank you.
Mark your calendar now for next year's Texas Wildlife Association 34th Annual Convention, coming up July 11th through 14th of 2019 in San Antonio. This is a production of Roland Recording.